Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. I generally use this introduction to tell the listeners what I'm going to speak about in the three sections of the program. But this time I want to speak about something important that I just became aware of after I prepared the rest of the program. And I want the listeners to be aware of something that is happening without fanfare, but it is of great importance. After the State of Israel was established and Jerusalem became the capital, the United States recognized Israel but did not recognize Jerusalem as the capital. The American embassy was located in Tel Aviv. Israel was the only country where the American embassy was not in the capital. It maintained a consulate in Jerusalem that served mainly the Arab population. Although Congress approved the moving of the American embassy to Jerusalem back in 1994 and 1995, the presidents from Clinton or Obama prevented the move by executive order. The first president to move the American embassy to Jerusalem was Donald Trump. He not only moved the embassy, but he closed the consulate that catered to the Arab population. Everything is now done to the U.S. Embassy, which is about a mile from where I live. Now, without fanfare, the United States is reopening the consulate in Jerusalem. So now we have both an embassy and a consulate here in the city, which is not a so subtle hint that the United States will eventually recognize the division of Jerusalem. That is the hint. That is the message of opening a consulate in addition to an embassy. That is a message that was sent by the Biden administration, and it is a message that we have to be aware of and responded to strongly. Our Prime Minister is going to visit Washington in a few weeks, and it's quite important that he brings this up with Biden. We'll have to see what will happen. I'd like to think that our Prime Minister, Bennett, is aware of this situation. I'm sure he has a lot to discuss with Biden, but this should be way up on the top of the agenda. I'll be back after the break.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again. I wasn't going to speak about Ben & Jerry's anymore. I thought that subject had been pretty much beaten to death. But something came across my desk this week, and I want to share it with the listeners because I think it's important. As we know, the board of Ben & Jerry's, which is based in Vermont, announced in July is boycotting Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria. The board initially sought to boycott all of Israel, but the parent company, the London-based Unilever, wouldn't allow that. What's happened in Israel in the meantime, that a lot of people who are supportive of Ben & Jerry, because they like the ice cream, and that includes me, we've been buying more to support the branch here in Israel. But this other information has become available, and as I said, I want to share with the listeners. Anuradha Mittal, Mittal, is the chairwoman of Ben & Jerry's board of directors. She has funneled thousands of dollars from the ice cream company to a radical Palestinian non-governmental organization that denies Israel's right to exist. The funds were transferred through the Oakland Institute, which is a progressive think tank founded by Mittal back in 2004. According to the London Jewish Chronicle, the Oakland Institute transferred $3,000 to the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. In 2016, this Badil Research Center, which is based in Bethlehem, which is in the Palestinian Authority area, Badil issued a controversial report defending armed struggle by the Palestinians against Israel. In 2019, the organization further dug in its heels and rejected new European Union requirements that NGOs not work with or provide funds to people or organizations that the European Union has designated on a terror list. The $3,000 which the Oakland-based institute transferred to Badil came from $80,000 grant supplied to the think tank by Ben & Jerry's Foundation. The foundation's website says it funds organizations in the United States that promote social justice. The fund was originally created in 1985. The Jewish Chronicle did not specify when the Oakland Institute transferred the money to Badil. But Badil's 2016 report said, and I quote, "The right to resist of people under foreign and colonial domination, including armed struggle, and the applicability of these provisions to the Palestinian people has been reaffirmed by many other UNGA resolutions. Equating all forms of resistance with terrorism as a justification for suppression lacks legal basis, as the Palestinian struggle for liberation is legitimate, and all actions carried out against Israel for that purpose are therefore lawful." NGO Monitor, which is a Jerusalem-based watchdog, pointed out that Mittal, that is this woman, the chair of Ben & Jerry's, has previously tweeted in support of BDS, signed a petition calling for an end to U.S. arms sales to Israel, retweeted support for release of Khalida Jarrar, a senior figure in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. NGO Monitor also noted that the Oakland Institute has also partnered with other problematic NGOs such as the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions and the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee. This was closed in 2015 by court order over issues of transparency in its funding, while the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee rhetoric accuses Israel of ethnic cleansing, accuses Israel of genocide, accuses Israel of apartheid, and accuses Israel of collective punishment. So this is a bit of a quandary now because so the bottom line here is that we're sort of left in a quandary. First of all, those of us in Israel who like Ben & Jerry's also would like to support the company here in Israel. I don't know the owner personally. My wife is friendly with his wife, but he supports a tremendous number of people here in Israel, and the plant is located in Yavne, which is an area where they really need the employment. So it's sort of a quandary for us because it's obvious that this Anuradha Mittal, who's the chairwoman of Ben & Jerry's board of directors, is a tremendous supporter of the Palestinian terrorism, so sort of leaves us in a bit of a quandary. One hand, we like the ice cream, which really doesn't really matter. We like to see the company here supported, but if it's going to close down anyhow, so that's the way it goes. You can't win them all. The question is whether or not, of course, one should support Ben & Jerry's in the United States. This money that you buy ice cream with might end up in the hands of terrorists in a not so subtle way. So I just wanted to share this information with the listeners. I just found this out this week, and I think it's important to know this. Now I want to say a few words about anti-Semitism. The word anti-Semitism first came into use by a guy named Marr, M-A-R-R, in the middle of the 19th century in Germany. Up to that time, if you didn't like Jews, you were a Jew hater. Then all of a sudden you became an anti-Semite. And now anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are being looked upon pretty much in the same. In the secular 19th century, Jews were designated as Semites, yet it was never intended to mean anything but Jews. You don't even hear Muslims or anybody living in the Middle East called a Semite. When you hear the word Semite, you automatically think of Jews. And back in the Soviet Union, which claimed not to notice any differences in people, Jews were designated as Zionists, not as Jews. And today, the designation of Zionism in the West is described as having a loathsome quality. In Christian Europe, the Jews were hated as Jews. To the Nazis, we were an impure race. To the Soviets, we're capitalists. And today, when the greatest sins of the world are racism and colonialism, the Jewish collective is defined as the ultimate bastion of white supremacy, and Israel seen as a state born in sin. It's interesting how definitions have changed. This has happened in the United States also. There was a time when there was something called socialism, and there are people who wanted to bring socialism to the United States. Today, nobody would dare to use that word, socialism, because socialism has a bad name, but those who want to attack the system in the United States, and that's a whole story unto itself, they use all kind of other names like Black Lives Movement and things of that nature. So the racism has taken on all kind of different faces. Years ago, anti-Semitism was based on religion. And now it's being based on human rights. In other words, years ago you hated Jews because they were Jews. Now you hate Jews because they're not good when it comes to human rights. The hate remains. It just changes its name. It's only by appealing to a distorted version of human rights that Israel and Zionism are equated. But what is Zionism? It's a Jewish liberation movement. It's only appealing to this distortion that somehow Zionism steps on other people. Some people continually agree to partition the land into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, are the ones standing in the way of a two-state solution. In other words, they keep changing the definition of anti-Semitism, and now it's anti-Zionism, and since the Zionists have established a state, it's now being accused of pushing out the Arabs. And it seems that politics has a need for scapegoats, So the Jews have been the designated choice to be the scapegoats under all kind of different names. This is a little bit complicated subject, and I want to continue in the next portion of the program. So in order to make my thoughts clear to the listeners, I'll be back after the break and talk a little bit more about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is the new word for anti-Semitism, and it's something we have to discuss a little bit so that the listeners understand, at least as far as I understand, what's happening in the world of the anti-Jewish thinking. I'll be back after the break.
Hi, I'm Steve Miller.
And I'm Matt Zucker.
Join us for Lighten Up, where we take a look at the week's current events in Israel and from around the Jewish world through a humorous lens.
If you've been paying attention during these crazy times, you know that it's a challenge to parody life anymore. But join Steve and I as we give it the old college try. Not only is being happy an obligation, but life is just too short to take it all so seriously.
So join me, Steve Miller.
And me, Matt Zucker.
For Lighten Up every Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Israel, only on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. As I started to say in the previous segment of the program, there's a lot of confusion. You have to realize that Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish people. That's the bottom line. Zionism had a goal of creating a state for the Jews in their ancient homeland. So there are two things involved. One is the creation of a state for the Jews, which is obviously needed not only after the hundreds of years of anti-Semitism, but because of the Holocaust. From the period of 1939 to 1945, the world was made up of two kinds of people, or two kinds of nations. Those who didn't want their Jews, and those who would not accept Jews. So it became obvious that there had to be a place where Jews could go, no questions asked. So even though the Zionist movement, the movement to create a Jewish state, a modern state in our ancient homeland, that was a form of nationalism. But after the Second World War, we came to realize that it's just more than nationalism. It has to be a refuge also for the Jewish people, because they weren't wanted anywhere else. And the period of 1939 to 1945 proved that. Now, there's a new thing now. I suppose you can call it Palestinianism. Now, Palestinianism has two goals. The immediate goal, or the goal that it says it has, is a Palestinian state under the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, based on the 1949 armistice lines, which comprise all of Judea and Samaria, which is called the West Bank, and eastern Jerusalem, and also the right of return for millions of Arabs living in towns and camps under the UN, and millions of others around the world. Now, nothing is said about the Gaza Strip because the Palestinian Authority was kicked out of there in a bloody takeover by Hamas, which is a terrorist organization and remains a terrorist organization. Obviously, anything that the Palestinians would set up, whether it's in the Gaza Strip or in what's Judea and Samaria, would not be democratic. But the bottom line is that the long-term goal both of Hamas and of the Palestinian Authority is the elimination of Israel, because this is explicitly stated in the PLO Covenant and in the Hamas Charter. These things were never taken out of these documents. So the ideology of Palestinianism, using that word, is that Israel is a settler colonial state that doesn't belong here. It established itself on Palestinian land, which oppresses Palestinians, and therefore Israel has no right to exist. They talk about self-determination and ending the occupation, but the long-term objective is the elimination of Israel. The failure to understand the nature and meaning of this led to the Oslo Accords, which legitimized it, granted the PLO a quasi-state, and divided Judea and Samaria into Palestinian-controlled areas. The issue of settlements remains controversial in Israel and other countries. There is no question, however, that Judea and Samaria, according to the archaeologists, contain literally thousands of Jewish historical sites, many as yet unexplored and unexcavated. There are no Palestinian historical sites in this area because Palestinian identity, it didn't exist. It is a recent phenomenon contrived back before the Six-Day War. It's contrived to oppose Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. There never was a Palestinian state. Now, many people consider the presence of Jews in Judea and Samaria to be illegal under international law. Now, but this law has never been clarified or determined. The claim that Israel is illegal under international law is accepted without any proof. Nevertheless, support for the Palestinian state as part of a peace process is and has been the policy of everyone, including the Israeli governments, for the last 40 years. This explains, incidentally, why Israel advocacy, what we call Hasbara, has failed, and why many, including those who consider themselves to be pro-Israel, are confused. And it could be the reason why many have turned against Israel. Israel has never explained itself properly. One of the greatest failures of Israeli diplomacy is the failure of Israeli advocacy. We have not explained the situation and the history of this area properly. Now, another source of confusion is the International Committee of the Red Cross, because the International Committee of the Red Cross determined Israel's presence in Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem violated the Fourth Geneva Convention, and they called it the Occupied Palestinian Territory. There was never a Palestinian territory. There was never a Palestinian state. The Red Cross has also decided that the Golan Heights belongs to Syria. The Red Cross arbitrary decision is considered to be the law and was adopted by the UN and other international organizations. It has been accepted without debate, and it's not subject to review. End the occupation and free Palestine are Palestinian mantras and the core of what I'd like to call Palestinianism. As part of a long-term agenda to create a Palestinian state, not in certain parts of our Holy Land, but from the river to the sea. It begins with the PLO, or a Hamas state in Judea, Samaria, and eastern Jerusalem. And of course, if the PLO gets a state, it will be kicked out of there by Hamas. So we're really dealing in the long run with Hamas. So if you start with a Palestinian state, it ends with the destruction of Israel. This whole idea is dangerous, it's destructive, and indeed it is immoral. We have come back to our ancient homeland. We have not kicked anybody out, and we have failed to explain our position. In the beginning, everybody thought, well, the Jews finally have a state. That's right. That makes sense. But now when somebody like the Palestinians come along and begin to debate whether this land really belongs to the Jews, we have been unable to successfully argue our situation. So this is the reality, and it's hard to argue with reality. And there's no doubt that Israel has been strong in just about everything, in defense and building up defense of the country. Israel is in the front line of modern science, modern developed. Israel is the do-it-yourself state. We help other countries. The one area which we have failed miserably, and it really acts against us, is the inability to express why we are here, explain why we are here, and explain why this is a Jewish homeland. And by the way, that is also not just a failure of our diplomacy, it's a failure of our own educational system. That is why the failure of Israeli education is the reason why we have parties such as Meretz that has representation in the Knesset, and actually is part of the current coalition, which supports the immediate goals of Palestinian self-determination and ending the occupation. They ignore the long-term objective of eliminating Israel, and they are unable to explain the righteousness of our cause. I'm talking about Israeli politicians, Israeli parties. So it's not only a failure of our what we call hasbara, of our presenting ourselves to the world, but is really a terrible failure of the Israeli educational system. That we have Jews, that we have Jewish parties here who do not understand the correctness and the righteousness of our own position. So the bottom line in anything is education. And the reason there is so much assimilation in the United States is a lack of education. And the reason that there are Jews here in Israel who don't understand the importance of this being a Jewish homeland, the only Jewish homeland, is a failure of education here. The failure of education is the greatest deficit of the Jewish people today, and it endangers our future, both here in Israel and in Jewish communities outside of Israel, in particular the United States. And assimilation is a story unto itself. I just tried to clarify this for the listeners. I'll be back after the break.
Are you tired of political correctness and the fear that you might offend someone?
I'm not afraid to offend you.
Wow, look who's talking tough.
One has to be tough to keep sane today.
Hi, I'm Alan Skorsky.
And I'm Beulah Seabrow.
And join us every Wednesday for The Definitive Wrap as we interview the most sought-after guests and expose progressive trends that masquerade as enlightenment but actually destroy our freedoms.
We are the No Woke Zone, so buckle up to this exciting show.
Buckling up, but I'm driving.
Sure, you can drive, but I'm the navigator.
Tune in for the No Nonsense, The Definitive Wrap Show, every Wednesday on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. In this segment of program, I want to do several items that I call under the radar, things that you don't notice, they don't get big headlines, but I think they're important to be known. The first has to do with the Temple Mount. At the present time, believe it or not, the Jordanian Minister of Religions recently revealed that there are 850 Jordanians are working at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem on behalf of Jordan's Ministry of Religion. In other words, at the Temple Mount, there are 850 Jordanian workers. Do we know the identities of these workers and how many of them are involved in incitement and terrorism? The cost of maintaining Jordanian workers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is funded by Jordan, is about 56 million Israeli shekels a year. As is well known, Jordan attaches great importance to its position as the guardian of the mosque because it has a rival, Saudi Arabia's traditional role as guardian of Islam's holiest shrines, which are in Mecca and Medina. The Temple Mount is at best the third holiest shrine in Islam, so the Jordanians are essentially the guardians of the third most important spot. There are 850 Jordanian employees. They're registered as official employees of the Jordanian Ministry of Religion, which is curious, as anyone visiting the mosque can attest. No more than a few dozen Jordanian security guards are visible, not hundreds, and certainly nowhere near 850. So who are the others? Where are they? And what are they doing? Now, apparently what's happening, according to a gentleman named Dr. Eddie Cohen, who writes for the Bessis Center at Bar-Ilan University, he said Jordan is using their employees as mercenaries in times of crisis. Many significant gatherings have sprung up almost instantly on a Temple Mount in recent years whenever the site deteriorated into violence, like during the recent Gaza war, during the Mercy Gate crisis back in 2019, and many other violent outbursts. In other words, these 850 Jordanian paid workers, who you don't see when you go up on the Temple Mount, might serve as a rapid incitement force that increases the volume of the violence at any event, and they may even stir up some events. So here's something which is really under the headlines. Hundreds of Jordanian paid workers on the Temple Mount were there, as I understand it, that they are there as mercenaries to be used in time of crisis or indeed to create a crisis. They are used to stir up the crowd, to conduct riots, or joins with a crowd to create a sense of togetherness against the occupation. If each one of these Jordanians brings along one or two men, in short time, thousands of rioters can be expected. This allows the organizers of the riots to put tremendous pressure on the Israeli authorities and render it difficult for them to calm the situation. So why are so many employees needed, and why does Israel allow such a large number? Do the security authorities know their identities? Is their income legally reported to the Israeli tax authorities? How many of them have been arrested, and how many are involved in riots or terrorism? These are open questions now, and they really have to be answered. In other words, the bottom line is there are hundreds of Jordanian employees on the Temple Mount here in Jerusalem who are used to stir up trouble when needed. And that is something that we should know more about. The next item, which is under the headlines, is interest. The Diaspora Affairs Minister, a fellow named Nachman Shai, has secured 40 million Israeli shekels in the state budget for purposes of funding progressive Jewish movements and activities in Israel. Progressive, of course, means other than the Orthodox. The money will be used within the framework of a new department for progressive Judaism, which will use the funds for projects both in Israel and outside of Israel. The budget of the Diaspora Affairs Ministry will be doubled under this new state budget, which was just passed, and the funds will be used for various purposes, including formal and informal education in the diaspora. In other words, there's not enough Jewish education outside of Israel, and Israel now is picking up the cudgel and is ready to indeed help communities outside of Israel in the field of Jewish education. The money will be spread across programs starting with those at a high school age through university students and including projects for young professionals. Now, these funds will be used, according to the government, to fight the rise in anti-Semitism in several countries where there are large Jewish communities, and to tackle physical threats and anti-Semitic incitement, including and particularly on social media. Social media, which is something that's spread over the last 7 years, is a terrible source of anti-Semitism. So the Nachman Shai, who's the Diaspora Affairs Minister, and I quote, he said, we're at the starting line for intensive activity, and the budget we have approved the opening shot. In recent years, the relationship between the State of Israel and the diaspora has faded, and the challenges have piled up. We anticipate a drastic rise in anti-Semitism, manifestations of extremism among American Jews, and knowledge gaps in relation to Israel. All of these are a warning light that must not be ignored. We will lay out long-term infrastructure plans in Israel and in the diaspora to correct the problems and to deal with the challenges that will arrive on our doorstep, unquote. Now, this is very interesting. When Israel was first founded, Israel relied primarily on American Jews for financial support. Now, we no longer have a problem of financial support. We're quite independent, thank heaven. Now we have a problem in the opposite direction. We have to help diaspora Jewry in the field of Jewry itself, of Judaism. And I'm not saying that we have to go to set up schools to make everybody Orthodox, but the fact remains that in particular in the United States, intermarriage, which is a sign of a lack of Jewish education, is tremendously on the rise. I don't remember the exact numbers. I think the last number I saw that 70% of Jewish men marry out. So we here in Israel now have to take on the responsibility of supporting Judaism and Jewry outside of the country. So it's interesting how over the last 70-some years, the situation has changed tremendously, totally 180-degree change. In the beginning, we here in Israel relied on the United States for financial support, and of course for political support, but really I think at that time it was primarily financial support. Now the ball is in our court. We here in Israel have to help particularly American Jewry, and not with money, but simply to remain Jewish. And so the situation, no one could have predicted a situation we have now. We used to need American money, and now they need our psychological and spiritual and educational support to maintain the Jewish community. By the way, all of this is outside of the ultra-Orthodox. They take good care of themselves. They're putting a tremendous accent and emphasis on Jewish education, but the lack of Jewish education reflects itself in the fact that so many Jews are no longer associating themselves with the Jewish community in the United States. So the ball is now in our court. This is something I think nobody would have predicted 75 years ago, but it's interesting how things have changed, and now it is our responsibility here in Israel to support Jewry outside of the country in more ways than one. Thanks again for listening. Jay Shapiro signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.